In this tutorial, we'll continue to look at the cutoff versus button 2-bet pots and focus on the force span low boards, specifically looking at some of the turn play after we've check raised the flop from the cutoff and how the cutoff and the button will continue after a flop check raise. As we remember from the last tutorial, on these lower boards, the cutoff is going to check at a reasonably high frequency. Here, 87.42 across these 16 different flops. And after they've checked, the button will bet into the cutoff at a reasonably high frequency, about 60% of the time across these boards. And then against a small bet, the cutoff will raise fairly aggressively, a little over 20% of the time. Let's have a look at some of these flops. Let's look at Jack 8-3. And we'll go for the check raise line and then a call. So looking at the strategy that checks, facing a small bet. Remember, the small bet denies equity from some of the very weak hands in the cutoff range. A lot of the cutoff's range will miss this board because the cutoff's range is very high card and offsuit heavy, as well as some of these suited King X and Queen X, and of course a lot of Ace X suited. And on these low boards, the cutoff has missed with all of their range, and so will in general be substantially overfolding against a small bet. Remember here, 25% pot bet has an alpha of about 20%. So folding at 29.5% means that bluffs will automatically make a small amount of EV. And we can check that out by looking at the weakest hand here in the buttons range. This 6-5 high, for example, with no backdoors, still has a betting EV of 1.3. You still got the backdoor straight draw with the 8 and the 3, but no backdoor flush draw, and still a betting EV of 1.3 signifies that the initial bet is somewhat profitable in the fact that the cutoff is overfolding. Now, to make up for the fact that the cutoff overfolds and also the fact that the button is betting a fairly substantial portion of their range for the small size, the cutoff is going to raise fairly aggressively and goes for this small check raise about 18.3% of the time on this Jack 8-3. And the check raise range, looking at things in terms of the relative density and the percentages, is very much overpair heavy. Remember, the cutoff has all the big overpairs pre-flop, which the button doesn't have, and also some of the stronger top pairs as well. On Jack 8-3, the cutoff does have all the sets, and so does the buttons. Remember, the button has some of the jacks, not as much, a lot of the 8s and all the 3s. So against the check raise, here this is the cutoff's continuing range, right? So the cutoff has risked 6 to win 7.5 plus 6, 13.5. And we can calculate alpha for that. So 6 divided by 13.5, 44.44. The alpha is 44.44, and you've got the button here folding at 37.1, which suggests that the cutoff's bluff raising range is fairly draw heavy. Looking at the bluff raises that the cutoff has, a lot of gut shots, some open-ended straight draws here, the 10-9, and then just random overcard type hands, Ace King, Ace Queen, a fair amount of Ace High with backdoor flush draw type stuff. A lot of stuff that the cutoff uses to go for this check raise. So here, for example, King 10 with a backdoor flush draw. It's got a backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw. The 10, Jack, and 8 can make a straight with a 9-7 run out. The King, Jack, and 10 can make a straight with an Ace Queen run out, and obviously there's no straight between the King and the 8. So it's going to be 2 backdoor straight draw potentials, as well as some backdoor flush draws. So for example, on the King 10 of spades, you've got backdoor spades, which also works pretty well. And obviously hitting a pair of kings makes you new top pair, and even a pair of 10s isn't going to be too bad in this small check raise line. Because the button is defending a lot of their pocket pairs below the jacks. Remember, the button is very pocket pair heavy pre-flop, so a lot of the semi-bluffs on the flop will be these pocket pairs and some of these ace highs like Ace Queen, Ace 10, and so a lot of them will fold out against this raise, or some of them will continue, Noticing here you've got these low pocket pairs continuing, sometimes potential for hitting a set, or just having the cutoff give up on the turn. So after that flop check raise, we'll have a look at some of these turn cards. Because by 4, and then let's play once is for the cutoff. A jack hitting isn't so great, right? Because the flop check raise range, the flop check raise call range for the button is going to be more jack X heavy than the flop check raise range for the cutoff. Looking here again, 14.0% top pair, and then 14.8% top pair for the button. But additionally, it blocks a lot of the top pairs in the cutoff's range, which makes up that value component. And so when a jack comes on the turn, it becomes a lot more difficult for the cutoff to have a reasonable bluff. Right? So the cutoff has to give up a lot of hands because their range is just that much weaker, having that many fewer jack X in the range itself. These lower cards down here, the 6, the 7, sorry, the 4, the 5, and the 6, they basically just miss for the cutoff, and so there's not going to be too much going on there. A lot of the draws that have check raised the flop revolve around the jack and the 8, and so there's not going to be a lot going on those low cards. An ace as well, against a small bet, a lot of the ace X will just call the bet rather than raising. There's a small amount of raising with some of the weaker ace X, but against that raise, the button's going to have much more ace X in the continuing range than raises than weak ace X in the cutoff's raising range. So they're 18.2%. It goes for the check raise in terms of random ace highs, and then after the ace highs raise, for the button's going to be continuing in the call range, 13.7% ace X. And don't forget that ace X is also slightly underrepresented because the button also has hands like ace jack, which make up a substantial proportion of the continuing range, and some ace 8 as well, a little bit of ace 3. So hitting the ace on the turn after the check raise call is actually going to be better for the button here, right? Here the top pair and good 2 pairs here. Top pair or better is probably about 16 plus 8 plus 7. So we're looking at about 30% of the range, roughly top pair or better. But then we look at top pair or better for the button. That's getting 12 plus 14 plus 9.3. It's about 35% of the range. And the top pairs that the button have and the 2 pairs that the button have are just stronger than the top pair and 2 pair that the cutoff has check raised. From the cutoff has check raised a fair amount of these suited ace X with a backdoor wheel draw, and some of the weaker ace X as well. And as a result, can't bet too often with these top pair hands, which are now really actually quite middling compared to the button's range, which is now heavy in the sets in the 2 pairs, ace jack in particular and ace 8. So for example here, if the button does end up continuation betting on this ace, there's a lot of raising from the button, and there's actually not a huge amount of folding either. These low pocket pairs can call this small bet and then bluff the river. So there's some EV in terms of bluffing the river there, and there's also some EV in drawing to a set. But a lot of the time you've got these large proportion of the trips and ace jack, the sets and ace jack, pocket 8s, pocket 3s, raising to this pot size raise. And then against that pot size raise, it's going to be a continuing range, fairly difficult to defend a top pair, right? Even hand as strong as ace king, betting small and then getting raised here is pretty bad. Even checking and then facing a pot size bet, some of these ace X, which have now just made top pair on the turn, have to actually fold because the cutoff's range that is making this bet is very polar, and the range which is represented is, looking at it here, basically 2 pair or stronger. And these lower pocket pairs are actually turning themselves into bluffs now, right? Because they can outdraw the new top pair. So look at the jack. Jack, once again, a lot of these jacks pretty bad for the cutoff. And so there's going to be a lot of checking and then a lot of checking and giving up. And so because the presence of the jack basically removes a lot of the value range for the cutoff, that just means that there's a lot more air left over. And so the button will actually want to bet small into that to deny the air and draws, right? and then the cutoff is going to go for a second check raise all the time and is overfolding by a substantial amount. Remember, alpha for a quarter pot bet is 20%. They're folding almost twice as much as that. Partly to do because of the fact that they have some bluffs which give up, and the fact that the jack is really bad, so there's even less value to be able to defend that. Let's say we have a look at a relative brick, 5 of hearts, for example. 5 of hearts, not so great for the cutoff again. All of the draws that have check raised to flop and now missed. And so there's not going to be a huge amount of betting. And then when there is betting, it's fairly polar. Looking at this, the small size here, this half pot size. The betting range is basically over pairs for value or better, and then just some bluffs accordingly to try and get value from the top pair hands. Right, so even top pairs isn't really betting too often. There's a little bit of top pair, top kicker, but weaker top pairs are just going to check now. And then he gets bet into. Remember, it's the same kind of thing where, like, we look at the ace board, so the ace turn. On the ace turn, there's a lot of sets and 2 pairs for the button. Here on the 5 turn, a little bit of 5x has made a set, and because a little bit of 5x has made a set, that improves the set density in the button's range up to 12% now, which is substantial. There's no 2 pairs. In contrast, on the ace of hearts turn, there was a lot of 2 pairs and fewer sets, and those 2 pairs were fairly dense in the button's range because they've got a lot of ace jack proof and some of the ace sets suited. Yeah. Okay, so here, looking at the 7. So the 7 completes a 10-9 straight. It's fairly good for the cutoff because of the completion of that particular straight. And also because it completes that straight, it's one of those things where, like, here on this flop, in the check raise range, because it's got 10-9 in it, it doesn't need to have the pocket 7s in it, in the sense that the 7 rank is protected by the 10-9. So it doesn't really need to be protected by having the set of 7s in there too often, right? The set of 7s is actually pretty weak. Also because, like, it doesn't actually make a super strong hand when the 7 comes. When the 7 comes, it completes a 10-9 straight, right? So the hand isn't actually very strong because it gets beaten up by those open-ended straight draws, which are now turned to set in the cutoff's range. In contrast to the 6, the 5, the 4, and the 2s. A little bit more calling of those pocket pairs to try and defend those lower ranks, giving a little bit of extra set to the button. So on the 7, it's not too bad for the cutoff. I'm betting about half the time. And the best turns are obviously this king and this queen, right? Because here, for example, this king. Remember how we said that a lot of those sort of Broadway and also Broadway even type hands will check raise as flop? Like a lot of these Broadway stuff with backdoors between the jack and the 8. A lot of that stuff will check raise, like king queen, for example, going for the check raise, ace king, sometimes going for the check raise, a lot of king jack, a lot of king 10, ace queen, etc. So on a king or a queen turn, right? Sorry, check raise call. On a king or a queen turn, the cutoff is going to actually have an equity advantage because a lot of their bluffs have made it now. And because a lot of their bluffs have made it, and the button really hasn't really drawn to any super strong hands like sets, the cutoff will continuation bet on the turn at a very high frequency, and a lot of this for this small size to just deny equity. Remember that when the queen comes, there's a little bit of straight. When the king comes, there's not so many straights, but there's still plenty of sets that are just called this check raise on the flop. So betting too big isn't really necessary because you run yourself into a set a bit too often. The point of betting big mostly is to try and get value from this new top pair that there's now turned. Remember, the button's also got some top pairs that have called this flop bet. And then so you've got the 3 bet sizes, this quarter pot, this half pot, and then this pot size bet. Looking at the value ranges for each one, you can see this quarter pot is very new top pair heavy, and even some of the jack X is blocking there. Looking at the half pot bet, it's fairly heavy in the new top pair at 21.6% of the time. Obviously there's some strong hands in there as well, but all of the newer top pairs represent the value range, and there's no real kind of middle pairish hands. A little bit of ace jack, but not much. A little bit of pocket queens, not much. And then this pot size bet is going for the trips mostly, the sets mostly, the 2 pairs, the other pairs with the aces, and top pair, top kicker, ace, king, king, queen. Really trying to pot it and get value from the new top pair that's turned, as well as some of the middle pairs. And then after there's a call and there's a brick. Like a lot of that stuff is going to just rip it all in. Like these sets and 2 pairs rips it all in. Even these top pairs, there's only a 1.5 inch pot bet left behind, right? you jam in the top pair, sure you run into a set 7.5% of the time, but that 7.5% of the time isn't that much compared to the 35% that needs to call. So there's 25-ish percent worse hands when you've got a hand like ace king. Ace is going for a sneaky check raise. If you get bet into, you just rip it in. It blocks the check back range with the ace high, right? So that's what's going on there. All right, I rambled a bit much about that one. Do we have time to talk about another flop? Maybe we just briefly touch on something like 10-5-2. Here on the 10-5-2, there's not as much straight draws up the top. So like check, and now you're facing this half pot bet, right? Because here on the 10-5-2 is actually really not quite good for the cutoff at all, because like on contrast on the Jack 8, there was some Jack X and some 8X suited, which could have hit that, but here on the 10-5-2, there's not so much 5X suited. There's almost no 3X, and sure there's plenty of 10X, but the buttons hit those sets in the 10, the 5, and the 2 fairly well, and also has the pocket jacks as a slight overpair as well. So here the button's betting this half pot, and once again going for a small check raise for the cutoff. Small check raise, a lot of 3-betting, because like this check raise is really, because the top rank is fairly low, right? A lot of the top pairs and sets and stuff a lot of the overpairs and the top pairs will want to check raise. And because the check raise range is fairly condensed, it's not particularly polar, there's this substantial 3-bet percentage for the button here. But say, for example, the button just calls. What are they calling with? They're calling with some of these pocket pairs of the various ranks, and a lot of these, and basically all the top pair. So when one of these ranks here between the 10 and the 6 hit, it does pretty poorly for the cutoff and does pretty well for the button in terms of EV, because remember, the button's going to have a lot of 10x in that calling range, a lot of the set of 9s, a set of 8s, and set of 7s, which could turn a set of 6s as well, which could turn a set. Remember, those pocket pairs will call this flop check raise, and some of the lower ranks will do reasonably well as well. In contrast, the 5, there's plenty of 5x and some 2x, which the cutoff here is using as a bluff raise, which the button doesn't really have too much 5x to be able to defend with on the 5 turn, right? The button would much rather have a hand like 7-5 or 5-4 or 5-3 suited to these pocket pairs, but the button just doesn't have them pre-flop. The button will just have to make do with defending these pocket pairs against this check raise. And so then when we see on a 5, this 5 is pretty good for the cutoff, right? Because the 5 has now completed some draws in terms of like trip draws for this 3 of a kind, right? The 6-5, 7-5, Queen 5, King 5, Ace 5 suited, and then also Ace 5 offsuit, going for the check raise on the flop, has now made trips. Those trips now have basically outdrawn the 10x and the other pocket pairs that the button was calling with, defending with on the flop against a flop check raise, and now because of that improvement in the strength of the hand, the cutoff's gone a continuation bet at a pretty high frequency, and also for a fairly big size, because the button's range is now fairly condensed, right? The button would have 3-bet a lot of the sets on the flop, right? When the 5 comes on the turn, there's not too much for the cutoff to be scared of, and so the cutoff's just gonna really hammer the button by making these nice big bets. And just looking at these 2 bet sides, pot size bet and this half pot size bet, there's no raising happening from the button, just because they're just so condensed. Yeah, they just got all this top pair on these pocket pairs, which is most of their range. And so like when the range is just top pair and pocket pair, and not a lot of sets, even though there's a little bit of sets, but a little bit of boats now, but not a lot of sets. And your value range here for the cutoff is trips and overpairs, right? Like the value range of like trips and overpairs just pinches the button's entire range. It makes it very difficult to defend with top pair against these big bets. There's even this half pot bet, you can throw in your own top pairs yourself for value, because you're just never getting raised. You're not running into stronger hands too often. So yeah, there's a bit of an overview about the different turn cards. We only looked at a couple of flops, but we looked at it in a little bit more depth. And that's just the flop check raise continuing range. So we looked a bit about the flop check raise and how those turns play out. In the next video, we'll probably move on to some of the 5-span high boards, and then the 5-span low boards in later videos. Looking at some of the different lines. The boards from here are going to be getting a little bit wetter and wetter, so 5-span and then 6-span and 6 linked. So we'll focus a little bit more on what happens when those straights and flushes come in on the turn, and also how to play those straight draws and flush draws on the flop as well. So thanks for watching this video, guys. I hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye now.